I'm really happy to introduce Rabbi Eva Cohen. I first met Eva long before she and I think even I were rabbis, and I met her in Minneapolis. I was introduced to her by Dr. Harold Launder, who was one of the lay leaders, and then Madrich, one of our leaders, trained leaders, in Minnesota at Oramet congregation. And Harold said, I want you to meet this very special young woman. And he was right. And it's really been exciting to watch Eva develop and study with her and teach and learn from her. So I just want to read a short bio to give you some more information about Eva, and then she will speak for about a half hour or so, and then we will have a question and answer. If you would like to put um, some information in the chat about who you are, where you're from, and what the temperature is where you live, I thought that might be fun to look at. So Rabbi Eva Cohen is the leader of Oramet, Minnesota Congregation for Humanistic Judaism. She is Oramet's first rabbi and the first humanistic rabbi in Minnesota. Rabbi Cohen grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, graduated from Brown University with a BA in anthropology and visual art. And after graduation, she returned to the Twin Cities and spent the next decade working in not-for-profits and as an artist while participating in local activism, including for LGBTQ marriage equality. She reconnected with Oramet, the congregation where she grew up, teaching in Oramet school, acting as school director from 2012 to 2017, and becoming passionate about humanistic Judaism as a source of meaning, connection, and inspiration. Rabbi Cohen was awarded her MA in Classical and Near Eastern Studies from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities in January 2020, and received rabbinic ordination from the IISHJ, our International Institute, in May of 2024. It was a wonderful celebration. She lives with her husband and 4-year-old daughter in Minneapolis. Her presentation topic today, which draws on her rabbinic thesis, reflects her enthusiasm for thinking critically about sex, love, marriage, and human relationships. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce Rabbi Eva Cohen.
Thanks so much, Miriam.
Sure.
And yeah, it's great to be here with everyone. Yeah, calling in from chilly Minneapolis. Um, yeah, before diving in, I want to offer just a quick content notice. Because yeah, my talk deals with sex and also touches on challenging topics like sexual violence and homophobia. I want you to please feel empowered to step away at any time if the subject matter brings up feelings that are challenging for you. And yeah, as Miriam noted, this talk covers material from my rabbinic thesis, looking at sex, love, and marriage beneath and beyond the chuppah from ancient to modern times.
Beneath and beyond.
I use a chronological framework, moving through a history of the life cycle from the biblical period. So that's approximately 1000 BCE to 70 CE, to the rabbinic period, um, covering the Tannaitic, Amoraic, and early through middle Gaonic periods, going from about 70 to 950 CE. Then looking at the late Gaonic, medieval, and early modern period, so from about 950 to 1800 CE, that brings us to about 200 years ago. And then finally the modern and contemporary period, from about 1800 CE to the present. And yeah, I emphasize analysis of primary textual sources. And I also go beyond ceremony to look at evolving laws, customs, and values around polygyny, intermarriage, and wrongful couplings. In my thesis, I also explore levirate marriage, divorce, adultery, betrayal and violence, and the good wife. And we don't have quite enough time to get into all of that today. Um, but putting the ceremony within this broader framework, we're able to put marriage ritual back in its larger sociocultural context. And in that way, also promote a more critical feminist reading of marriage as a Jewish institution. So, starting with the biblical period, while biblical narratives are invoked to justify ceremonial practices that develop in the post biblical period, there actually aren't wedding ceremonies in the Hebrew Bible. Instead of retrojecting later practices, we really need to look at the biblical evidence itself to understand First and Second Temple period norms around courtship and marriage. The
Eva, can I
Yep.
interrupt you just for a sec? Some people are having trouble hearing you, so if there's a way you can get closer.
Okay. How is my voice now? Is that better? Okay. Let's see. So, the pairing of male and female, man and woman, in the Torah's two creation stories opens a window into these norms. In the first story, God creates man in his image, male and female, he created them. And after blessing the pair, he tells them to be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it. This God, high handed and remote, does place the sexes on equal footing. Created together as two halves of a human whole, they're commanded to act like God on earth, creating more humans and dominating their sphere. The Genesis 2:4b through 3:24 story, which comes from a different author who characterizes Lord God in more intimate, accessible terms, reveals biblical era gender hierarchies. Instead of creating male and female together, the Lord God makes man first, ha-adam, literally the human, but gendered in masculine terms, and then reflects, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make a fitting helper for him. After some animal beta tests, the Lord God takes a rib from the man while he sleeps, makes it into a woman, and brings her to him. Man is first creation, primary. Woman is second creation, supplementary, a fitting helper to man instead of an equal partner or a main character in her own story. This one shall be called woman, Isha, for from man, Ish, was she taken, the man says, punning on the two words' similar sounds while emphasizing woman's dependence on man. He has power to name her, and her existence is contingent on her formation from his primal body. The word wife appears in the Hebrew Bible for the first time in the next verse. Hence a man leaves his father and clings to his wife, Ishto, so that they become one flesh. The the biblical Hebrew word for woman, Isha, is the same as the word for wife. Ishto is Isha with a possessive suffix. Well, there's a long history behind the choice to translate Ishto as his wife here. This translation hides the Hebrew's conceptual slipperiness. The woman is his, the possessive asserts dominance that cuts through the softening act of his clinging to her. But what makes her a wife as opposed to just a woman who he claims? When the next verse shifts from marriage etiology back to narrative, translations across time and traditions make the same choice, a rendering Vayihu Shnehem Arumim Ha'adam Ve'ishto, as the two of them were naked, the man and his wife. Where the Hebrew is ambiguous, the English is certain. She is his wife, not just his woman. In Genesis 4:1, the man is first described as having knew Yada, his wife Eve, in a sexual sense, and then she conceives and bears Cain. As Ivan G. Marcus observes, No other gesture or ceremony on Adam and Eve's part signals that they are man and wife, not just man and woman. The rabbis of late antiquity saw this unceremonious union as the first arranged marriage, with God playing parent and matchmaker to his human children. Other Hebrew Bible narratives echo this norm, casting fathers or other male relatives as authorities in charge of marriage. Like their real counterparts, these ancient fictional patriarchs broker alliances between ethnically and religiously compatible families for financial, social, and political reasons. They see relatives, especially cousins, as desirable marriage partners. Love might come before or after marriage, but it wasn't the driver. A union of two families, not individuals, was uppermost on everyone's mind. Other biblical narratives of courtship and marriage reveal more early customs. Genesis 24, the most elaborate biblical courtship narrative, tells the story of how Abraham sends his senior servant to get a wife for my son Isaac. In true God-fearing patriarchal style, Abraham drives the search and insists on a non-Canaanite wife from his own homeland. Unlike the Genesis 2:24 man who leaves his parents to cling to his wife, Abraham asserts that the marriage must be patrilocal, bringing the bride to live with Isaac's family, while affirming that she must consent to be taken. He has his servant bring camels and other courtship goods, and his servant identifies the well outside his destination city as the place to find a suitable maiden. That maiden turns out to be Rebecca, born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. She's Isaac's first cousin once removed. Her beauty and virginity make her even more desirable. The servant gives her gifts, a gold nose ring and 2 gold bands. When he asks Rebekah's family for permission to take her as Isaac's wife, Rebekah's brother Laban and father Bethuel answer, "Take her and go, and let her be a wife to your master's son, as the Lord has spoken." Then the servant gives objects of silver and gold and garments to Rebekah, and presents, migdanot, akin to a bride price, to her brother and her mother. When asked, "Will you go with this man?" Rebekah replies, "I will." Her consent matters, though clearly the men are doing the arranging. As Rebekah's family sends her off, they give her the following blessing, which later Jewish tradition adopts as a pre-betrothal blessing for the bride. "O sister, may you grow into thousands of myriads. May your offspring seize the gates of their foes." Then Rebekah and her maids travel with Abraham's servant, and Isaac and Rebekah see each other across a field as she approaches. She covers herself with a veil, and after Isaac hears the servant's story, Isaac then brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah and took Rebekah as his wife. Isaac loved her and thus found comfort after his mother's death. First an arranged match and her agreement, then a consummated union, followed by the possibility of love, at least theoretically in that order, is the model in Rebekah's wedding to Isaac, Marcus observes. Other Genesis courtship and marriage narratives echo practices showcased in the Isaac-Rebekah story while offering some additional cultural data. I won't get into all the details. I'll just note that when Jacob, kind of against his will, marries Leah, and then, is promised that he'll receive her sister Rachel too. He's told that this will be after the bridal week of this one, Shavua Zot, literally week of this one. And in Samson, the story of Samson in Judges, we also see the celebration of a marriage for 7 days of feasting. So here the number 7 is showing up, like it is in a lot of Jewish life cycle events from antiquity. The 7-day celebration after birth, Shavua Haben, the wedding feast, and then the 7 days of mourning right after burial of the dead, Shiva. And we see with Jacob payment of a bride price through serving his father-in-law, kind of delayed assertion of patrilocality. He brings his wife, children, and household back to his father Isaac's home and domain. We see a technical term for bride price, mohar, show up in the story of Dinah, and then again in the Davidic narrative. And other comments I would make about those stories more extensively at another time. In biblical poetry and prophetic texts, the visible trappings of marriage become material for metaphor and poetic effusion. Psalms 19:6 compares the sun's rising to a groom coming forth from the chamber, chupato, literally his nuptial chamber. And then as part of a call for communal lament, Joel 2:16 exhorts, let the bridegroom come out of his chamber, chedro, literally his room, the bride from her canopied couch, chupata, and here in this case, that's literally her nuptial chamber. The JPS translation of chupato as the chamber and chupata as her canopied couch obscures the term's common base, chuppah, a nuptial chamber, or in non-nuptial contexts, a porch. And so what is a nuptial chamber? Not a term we use very often. In the Hebrew Bible texts cited, the term seems to be indexing a room from which a groom or bride emerges to be married, like in a bride's room or a green room today. Other texts describe brides wearing jewels and finery, and grooms wearing turbans or headdresses and crowns. During the Second Temple period, L.Z. Stern asserts, grooms did wear crowns. Post-temple destruction, the practice was abolished as a sign of mourning. And then looking at the prophetic texts, as well as a significant poetic one, where Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Hosea present extended metaphors of abusive relationship, Song of Songs is a love poem that offers an alternative model of relationship, as it alternates between first-person narrators, a woman and a man in love, who shower compliments on each other as they pursue each other eagerly across a pastoral spring landscape. The woman, who the man repeatedly addresses as bride, kala, expresses her own agency, claiming the man she loves as she celebrates their mutual belonging to each other. My beloved is mine, and I am his. Dodi li va'ani lo, she rhapsodizes, and in a later inversion, I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. Ani lidodi vidodi li. Particularly over the past century, Stern highlights how this declaration of mutual love has been frequently reused in wedding liturgies, music, and art. So these are the ancient patriarchal foundations on which later Jewish tradition builds ceremonies of engagement, betrothal, and marriage. But as I mentioned earlier, I want to connect biblical marriage ritual with larger conversations about marriage, gender, theology, and power in the biblical period. I do this by exploring biblical period laws, customs, and values around polygyny, intermarriage, and wrongful couplings. So first, polygyny. The Hebrew Bible often mentions men's marriage to multiple wives. While Marcus argues that with notable exceptions, the biblical narrative makes monogamy the model, Shimon bar Ephrat affirms that polygyny was allowed and probably widely practiced in well-to-do families during the biblical period. The biblical text abounds with examples from Abraham's messy entanglement with both his wife and her Egyptian maid Hagar, to Jacob's marriage to rival sisters Rachel and Leah, to King David's many wives and concubines. Interestingly, the boundaries between wives and concubines in the biblical text are blurred. Genesis 25 describes how Abraham took another wife, Isha, whose name was Keturah, and Keturah bears sons. But a few verses later, the text states that Abraham willed all that he owned to Isaac, but to Abraham's sons by concubines, Hapilagshim, the concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living. If all but Isaac, son of Sarah, are Abraham's sons by concubines, this means that Keturah's sons are sons by concubines, and that Keturah herself is a concubine, not a wife, counter to her verse 1 identification. John D. Levinson notes that medieval French rabbi Rashbam identifies Keturah and Hagar as the concubines. The Hebrew term Isha's conceptual slipperiness is relevant here. When a man takes a woman, whether she's considered his wife or his concubine, may depend on shifting preferences and family politics in narrative, the vagaries of biblical authors, or translators' biases. Witness JPS's translation of Genesis 34. So she gave him her maid Bilhah as concubine, but the Hebrew actually reads leisha, meaning as a wife or as a woman. Genesis 39 reflects the same tendentious translation choice. In the biblical period, wives and concubines may have been categories that were less fixed and more fluid than modern people assume. And while we don't have time to really discuss the Hebrew Bible's treatment of adultery, which it forbids and makes a capital crime, the biblical definition of adultery reflects women's disempowered position in a polygynous society driven by patrilineal inheritance norms and their attendant pressure to control paternity. In contrast with the term's modern American definition as voluntary sexual intercourse between a married person and someone other than that person's current spouse or partner, in the Hebrew Bible, adultery refers to voluntary sexual relations between a married or engaged woman and a man other than her husband or fiancé. It does not refer to the extramarital relations of a married man. In polygynous societies, a wife might share her husband with other wives and did not have an exclusive right to him. A married man could have sex with any woman who wasn't claimed by another man. A married woman could only have sex with her husband. Deuteronomic law and biblical narrative attest to the anxieties that polygyny fostered. Deuteronomy 21:15 through 17, Bernard M. Levinson comments, uses the norm of primogeniture, in other words, the right of inheritance by the firstborn, to protect the son of the less favored wife from disinheritance. Deuteronomy 17:17 legislates that the king shall not have many wives, lest their heart go astray. Polygynous alliances open more possibilities for kings' affections to be drawn toward other gods and kingdoms and away from Yahwist and local concerns. The Hebrew Bible's strongest opposition to intermarriage is on these grounds, that men marrying foreign women will be drawn to their wives' gods and away from Yahweh. And when you take wives from among their daughters for your sons, their daughters will lust after their gods and will cause your sons to lust after their gods. Exodus 34:16 warns. Other biblical law and narratives similarly warn against intermarriage, framing it as a cause of divine anger and punishment. But the picture is more complicated. For all the narratives that characterize intermarriage negatively, others depict it neutrally. In Numbers 12, after Moses marries a Cushite woman and Miriam and Aaron challenge his leadership because of it, the Lord castigates them for speaking against my servant Moses, with whom I speak mouth to mouth. Here the biblical authors make God himself the unlikely defender of one particular intermarried Israelite, if not of intermarriage in general. Perhaps the widest gap between perspectives on intermarriage emerges in the Persian period, approximately 539 to 333 BCE. Ezra and Nehemiah rage against intermarriages between the Jews returning from exile in Babylonia and the peoples of the land, particularly people brought to the area by Assyrian king Esarhaddon after deporting the northern kingdom population. Per Hindi Naman, in Ezra's view, if the crisis of intermarriage is not averted, the returnees will risk losing Jerusalem, Judah, and the right to practice temple ritual. Nehemiah emphasizes the linguistic and cultural erosion that intermarriage produces, describing how Jews had married Ashdodite, Ammonite, and Moabite women, and a good number of their children spoke the language of Ashdod and the language of those various people, and did not know how to speak Judean. Not only do Ezra and Nehemiah condemn intermarriage and make the Jews pledge not to intermarry, but Ezra actually pushes the returnees to expel their foreign wives and their intercultural children. Probably composed in the exilic or post-exilic period, Ruth counters Ezra Nehemiah in sympathetically portraying a Moabite widow whose loyalty to her mother-in-law and her adopted people in faith endures after the death of her Judahite husband. Do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you, Ruth begs her mother-in-law. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. By making Ruth a great-grandmother of King David through her second marriage to her deceased husband's kinsman, the narrative transforms the foreign wife from dangerous outsider to Jewish continuity-promoting insider. In the contrast between Ezra Nehemiah's and Ruth's perspectives, intermarriage emerges as a live issue. Not only intra-biblical evidence, but extra-biblical evidence, like the marriage contracts from 5th and 4th century BCE Elephantini, show that marriage between Jews and non-Jews in the Persian period were frequent. The biblical text offers forceful perspectives not only on intermarriage, but on other kinds of coupling that it considers wrong. Leviticus 18 warns against copying the practices and following the laws of Egypt and Canaan, commanding that none of you shall come near anyone of his own flesh to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. According to the text, which provides the most comprehensive listing of incestuous relations in ancient Near Eastern legal literature, the prohibited women include many relatives by blood and marriage, along with any woman not otherwise prohibited if taken along with her daughter or granddaughter, two otherwise unprohibited sisters if both living, any menstruating woman, and a neighbor's wife. The chapter continues with the directive, do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. It is an abhorrence, and an injunction against bestiality. Per the text, to violate any of these commandments is to defile the land and cause it to spew out the people. Violators will also be cut off from their people. Later chapters in the Holiness Code give specific punishments for condemned couplings, ranging from capital punishment and blood guilt on both parties if a man lies with his father's wife or lies with a male as one lies with a woman, to remaining childless if a man marries the wife of his brother. In its prohibitions and curses, Deuteronomy echoes and elaborates on some of these Levitical prescriptions. Leviticus 21 also maps out prohibitions on who the priests, the sons of Aaron, can marry. That's something I'd get more into at another time. And on the broader topic, though, of prohibited marriages and sexual couplings, the biblical text is a witness to shifting norms or to contentions about norms, along with gaps between biblical law and practice. Jacob marries two living sisters and makes them rivals, violating Leviticus 18:18, while Moses' parents are characterized as nephew and paternal aunt, a violation of Leviticus 18:12. Descriptions of David and Jonathan's intimacy also thrum with homoerotic possibility that tows against the violent homophobia of Leviticus. Jonathan's soul became bound up with the soul of David. Jonathan loved David as himself, the narrative reads, later having a grieving David cry, "My brother Jonathan, you were most dear to me. Your love was wonderful to me, more than the love of women." And then transitioning to the rabbinic period. In that transition from the biblical period of the priests, temple, and biblical textuality to the rabbinic period of the rabbis, synagogue, and biblical interpretation through Mishnah and Talmud, Judaism transformed. Rabbinic authors grappled with ambiguities, gaps, and outdated laws in the biblical text to create new rabbinic laws with the same constructed authority and pedigree as the biblical text. They achieved this by understanding Mishnah and Talmud, oral law, as halacha received at Sinai along with the written law. As part of their halakhic revolution, the rabbis reinvented biblical marriage laws and practices to fit their transformed Jewish worlds. The world of the Mishnah's composition is the first 2 centuries CE in Roman Palestine. The world of the Babylonian Talmud's composition is the 3rd through 6th centuries CE in Babylonia. And in doing this interpretive work, they birthed a new rabbinic approach to marriage that still guides traditional Jews today. So looking first at the Tannaitic or Mishnaic development, where biblical marriage was a civil arrangement achieved by paying a bride price and then taking a woman, the rabbis first tried to make marriage a public event and later on a sacred union. Some of their efforts involved formalizing and elaborating the betrothal process. Though the biblical text distinguishes between a betrothed woman and a married woman, it doesn't legislate how betrothal should be achieved. Is it through payment of a mohar, a bride price? Through making some other arrangements? Through sexually consummating the relationship? Different biblical examples suggest different strategies. Responding to this ambiguity, the Mishnaic rabbis clarify that a woman is niknet, acquired by a man in 3 ways: through money, through a document, and through sexual intercourse. Only one of these acts is required, and it had to be accompanied by the man's verbal declaration that it was undertaken with the express intention on the man's part to betroth the woman. There's no real ceremonial embroidery, but in another Tannaitic text, the Palestinian Tosefta, there's a recording along with other variations of a betrothal formula that later rabbinic tradition accepts and elaborates. Hare at mekudeshet li, see now, you are sanctified to me. In Mishnah Kiddushin 2's discussion, which opens by stating that a man can betroth, mekadesh, literally sanctify or consecrate a woman himself or via his agent, the Mishnaic rabbis shift from using the language of acquirement to the language of betrothal. In other places, they reference betrothal using the biblical synonym erusin. Within the larger Kiddushin tractate, they codify all kinds of specific conditions impacting the validity of a betrothal, ranging from its invalidity if brokered on terms misleading a woman to her disadvantage, to its validity if effected between an agent and a woman, even if that agent was sent to betroth the woman to another man. Oops. The rabbis also establish a legal point that crackles with violent patriarchal significance and becomes a lightning rod for future anti Semitism. They legislate that a girl 3 years and 1 day old is betrothed through intercourse. Their statement reflects a context that normalizes betrothal by rape of a 3-year-old girl, along with their tacit endorsement of the practice that they neither forbid nor halakhically invalidate. The Mishnah also sets how much time should elapse between betrothal and marriage. While the biblical text is legally silent and narratively ambiguous on this point, an extra biblical text, Tobit, compresses arrangement, betrothal, and marriage into one rite. The Mishnaic rabbis separate betrothal and marriage by specific units of time. Livetula, to a virgin, they grant 12 months between betrothal and marriage to prepare herself, allowing a man the same time for preparation. To a widow, in contrast, they give 30 days. These timelines are pragmatic. It would have been more common for a new bride and her family to require at least a year to gather everything they needed for a new household, while a widow likely retained most of the household necessities from her previous marriage. The Mishnaic rabbis also legislate different ketubah or ketubah payments to women entering marriage as virgins versus those entering it as widows. What purpose does a ketubah serve? Designed to protect the wife should the marriage end by her husband's death or by divorce. It creates a deferred lien against the husband's estate that must be paid to the widow or divorcee unless she's judged at fault for the dissolution of the marriage. This safeguards the bride against abandonment and gives a double incentive to both partners to protect the marriage bond. And then looking at further development in the Amoraic or Talmudic period, as well as the Gaonic, the early Gaonic, um, I think it's important to look at these phases individually because there's a multi-stage process of halakhic development that's happening. And yeah, part of the Amoraic transformation of marriage involves formally recognizing the stage before betrothal, the stage of making arrangements. While the Mishnah doesn't discuss this stage, the Babylonian Talmud, Ketubot 102a 1 through 2, describes the pre-betrothal process of families negotiating financial contributions to their respective children if they marry. Later in the Kiddushin tractate, there's a description of how Rav would flog a man if he betrothed a woman without making a shidduchei arrangement first. And while Mishnaic legislation tacitly encourages betrothal through money over betrothal through sexual intercourse by elaborating the financial approach more fully, the Babylonian Talmud actually condemns betrothal through intercourse. The Talmudic text describes how Rav would also flog a man for dimekadesh bevia, betrothing through sexual intercourse, and for betrothing a woman in the marketplace. To betroth through sex or in the marketplace implies a casual sexual liaison or marriage of convenience enacted either in seclusion from others or in an anonymous public space. To exert control over sexuality, disincentivize promiscuity, and protect women from abandonment, the Talmudic rabbis pushed to make the relationship public, with monetary consequences for walking away after a brief fling. The Amoraim also consider the role of female agency in the betrothal process. Um, they see how the Mishnah frames betrothal as the woman being niknate, acquired, not as the man acquiring her, and read this as indication that the man cannot take her against her will. A woman can only be betrothed with her consent, the text rules. And as Marcus correctly notes, her role in effecting the betrothal is still passive. It requires no speech, acts, or other positive acts from her, and her silence is construed as consent. Age of consent also enters the discussion. While the Talmudic rabbis affirm the Mishnaic ruling that a girl 3 years and 1 day old can be betrothed via sexual intercourse, and by implication can also be married after this age, in another sugya they assert the opinion of some rabbis that a father can't betroth his daughter to a man until she's a grown woman capable of forming her own opinions on the man she wants to marry. Under the rabbinic system, the scope of patriarchal control over girls' and women's bodies and marital decisions emerges as a live exegetical issue. Compared to the temple sacrifice-oriented biblical priestly authors who keep betrothal and marriage in the civil realm, the rabbis are more invested in delimiting patriarchal authority and exerting rabbinic control over these activities. As part of this broader agenda, the Amoraim transform betrothal from a secular transfer of rights into a religious rite with its own blessings to be recited in the house of the betrothal. They give the following blessing language. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctified us through his mitzvot and commanded us concerning the forbidden relatives, and prohibited to us those women who are betrothed, and permitted to us those women who are married by means of the wedding canopy and betrothal. And one variation adds the following, Blessed are you, Lord, who sanctifies Israel by means of the wedding canopy and betrothal. Turning to Nisuin, or marriage itself, the Talmudic and Gaonic rabbis also develop religious rituals that fill the earlier tradition's ceremonial blank. The Amoraim call for reciting the Birkat Chatanim, the blessing of the grooms, in grooms' houses in a minyan or quorum of 10, all 7 days of the wedding celebration, with the opinion credited to Rav Yehuda that the repetition applies only when there are new guests. They also give the text of the Birkat Chatanim, which enfolds 6 blessings that exactly match 6 of the 7 blessings in what later Jewish tradition dubs the Sheva Brachot. These 6 blessings bless God for creating all things and humanity in his image, for gladdening Zion through the ingathering of her children, for bringing joy to the groom and bride as he did to his creations in the Garden of Eden, and for creating joy and gladness, groom and bride, peace and friendship, bringing joyous wedding sounds back to Jerusalem in prophetic language that pulls from Jeremiah 33, 10 through 11, and making the groom rejoice with the bride. The transformation of 6 blessings into 7 is a later Gaonic innovation, likely influenced by early Christian custom, the addition of a wine blessing to introduce the 6 Talmudic blessings turns the 6 into 7. And this outlasted other regional variations to become the enduring practice. And other wedding rituals are first attested in the Talmudic text, including the Babylonian custom of putting burnt ashes on the groom's head, where he would wear tefillin as a reminder of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The Talmudic text also references the ultimate or final stage of nisuin, when the groom takes the bride into the wedding chamber to sexually consummate the marriage. The phrase niknasa lechuppah, she entered into the wedding chamber, appears in rabbinic debate about whether a woman who has gone into the bridal chamber without having intercourse can be considered a virgin. The chuppah has transformed from the biblical green room, from which bride or groom emerges to be married, into the wedding chamber where they retreat together to consummate their marriage. With entering the chuppah established as Nisuin's conclusion, the concept's tight linkage but not total synonymy with consummatory intercourse seems to be generating new halakhic uncertainty. The rabbis wonder whether a woman who has entered the chuppah but is widowed or divorced before having sexual intercourse is entitled to the additional sum of her marriage contract. Is it the affection of the chuppah or the affection of the intercourse that solidifies her status as a married woman? Does the affectional calculus change if a bride starts menstruating, making her unfit for intercourse according to the laws of nidah? The rabbis leave this question unresolved. Ceremonial elaboration on the biblical act of taking a wife creates a new liminal zone between wedded and bedded, and gives the rabbis more reason to justify their role as halakhic arbiters. And just as the rabbis creatively erected ceremonies of engagement, betrothal, and marriage on patchy biblical foundations, they transformed the larger biblical inheritance of laws, customs, and values around polygyny, intermarriage, and wrongful couplings. And I'll speak a little bit to those and then transition to questions. So the Mishnaic and Talmudic texts treat men's marriage to multiple wives as a legal given. Implicit in the Mishnaic prescription on betrothing two women with a single item worth one peruta is the assumption that betrothing two women at the same time is acceptable if the act is performed with a separate, appropriately valued item designated for each woman. Mishnah legislation also empowers a surviving brother to consummate relationships with all his yevamot, with all the childless wives of his deceased brothers, and to stay married to a barren woman if he takes a fertile wife to fulfill the mitzvah of procreation. Responding to the Deuteronomy 17:17 legislation that the king shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray, the rabbis, without explanation, rule that 18 wives is the ceiling. Rabbi Yehuda says that the king can have many, as long as they don't turn his heart. The Amoraim recommend no more than 4 wives for an ordinary man, permitting marriage to 4 widows so long as the husband has means to support them. More than 4, they argue, would interfere with his ability to fulfill his wife's monthly conjugal rights. Going beyond tolerance for polygyny to advocacy in favor of it, the Babylonian Talmud contains 2 textual traditions that advise a man to take an additional wife in 2 specific situations: when he is married to a bad wife who has a large ketubah, and when he finds himself married to 2 wives, and hence vulnerable to the demonic power of pairs. And then, while the antique rabbis' treatment of polygyny as a social and legal given is consistent with the larger biblical tradition, the rabbinic perspective on intermarriage rejects the hardened opposition of Ezra and Nehemiah in favor of a qualified, Ruth-esque endorsement of marriage to the convert. And that's something I would speak in more detail about at another time. The rabbis also nuanced the biblical legislation on wrongful couplings, clarifying and expanding on what unions are permitted while also grappling with sexual diversity unaddressed by the biblical text. Um, and they bring Leviticus 18 into conversation with their betrothal framework, asserting that two men who betroth two women are each liable for forbidden intercourse with a married woman if they wife swap on entering the chuppah. And they say the wife swappers are liable for forbidden intercourse with a brother's wife if they're brothers. Um, the Tanaim also confront the implications of Leviticus prescriptions on lying with a man as one lies with a woman. They reason that an androgynous, an intersex person, can marry a woman but can't be married by a man, and attribute to Rabbi Eliezer the claim that a man who has intercourse with an intersex person is liable to stoning, as though he had relations with a male. This legislation expands the rabbinic imaginary to include people with physical or biological sex characteristics beyond the binary, while simultaneously forcing the binary categorization of these intersex people, reinscribing violent Levitical homophobia. Read in dialogue with Mishnah Yevamot 8:6, does the Mishnah Kiddushin 4:14 statement that a bachelor may not herd cattle, nor may two bachelors sleep with one covering, but the rabbis permit it, reflect a softer stance on male-male relations, or just a desire to ignore transgression when there's plausible deniability? The Amoraic interpretation of that statement about bachelors leans into plausible deniability. It is taught in the Tosefta, the rabbis state, that they said to Rabbi Yehuda, Jews are not suspected of homosexual intercourse, nor of engaging in intercourse with an animal. No need to prevent bachelors from sharing a blanket, or to scrutinize those who do, if Israel is too pure to engage in queer sex acts that we know are practiced by at least a portion of the population across all human societies. And I think at this time, I'm going to pause here. I've covered material from the biblical and the rabbinic period. And yeah, maybe on another occasion, I could come back and tell you more about later periods. But I'd like to open things up to questions, yeah, about that material or other things related to the history of Jewish marriage.
Thanks so much, Eva. I really appreciate the depth of which you have shared with us all these conflicting and interesting manifestations of love and connection that we don't necessarily understand unless somebody illuminates it for us. So thank you so much. For questions, you can just unmute yourself and speak up, or if you want, raise your hand and I will acknowledge you. Although that might be Eva Goldfinger.
I'm just curious, Eva, why even today and in our movement, many people continue to translate Ani ledodi, v'dodi li, which literally means I am for my, le is for my beloved, and my beloved is for me, to the possessive of I am my beloved's and my beloved mine. Don't you think it's time we eliminated that possessive translation?
I think that's a good question and an interesting one. Yeah, I think, and yeah, like what's implied by, yeah, being for someone versus them belonging to you. Yeah, I think there's certainly an argument to be made there. Yeah, I guess, yeah, with translation, and like we see this with other things, it's like there's certain conventions and like grooves that form, and then everyone's familiar with hearing a certain, things in a certain way, and it can be hard to break out of that. But yeah, I mean, I think that is arguably a more accurate translation, and yeah, maybe better aligned with our values.
I just wanted to encourage our rabbis to use that translation, especially when they're doing it under a chuppah, just to encourage our style of beliefs.
Mm, thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Eva. Stephen Braun?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting topic, Rabbi, and I appreciate you spending your time researching this and giving it to us. I was wondering, was polygraphy possibly encouraged because the rate of children surviving birth may have been uh, very small at that time. The science and medicine weren't developed, and therefore they wanted as many children to be born from as many women as possible, therefore uh, permitting polygamy.
Hmm. I mean, I think when we look at patterns across different cultures and across time periods, I guess where you have that sort of like polygynous practice, what it does seem to map onto is where you have like greater um socioeconomic hierarchy, and it's like a smaller number of powerful men who are having a lot of wives, and then other men with fewer resources less so. So yeah, I think it was, I mean, maybe it was about, I guess, maximizing their ability to reproduce these, like, this smaller subset of powerful men, but yeah, not necessarily benefiting the whole community or population.
Thanks. We have one last question. I'll read it from Peter from the city congregation. Are there any elements of the wedding ceremony that should be eliminated, or should we take another look at to use in a secular humanistic ceremony? For example, the bedecken.
That's a great question. And I think my position is that all of the traditional elements of the Jewish wedding ceremony are salvageable if we make significant modifications to them. I think the bedecken, um, the veiling, doesn't need to be understood as implying, anything we do or don't agree with. I mean, yeah, sort of thinking of it almost like a first look, in the same, like, oh, here you are on the wedding day, you look beautiful, I look beautiful, it's nice to see each other. Other customs like circling, like that can be done in an egalitarian kind of way, two partners circling each other. Even the language of the languages of the betrothal blessing, the language of other blessings can be transformed to be non-theistic, to emphasize our humanistic values, emphasis on love, egalitarian partnership. The language of the ketubah can be transformed. Yeah, we don't necessarily have to feel like, we must be enacting, all of these Jewish traditions. Like, we're not a slave to that tradition. We use and reinterpret the things that feel meaningful and important to us. And if they don't, then they don't, and then we can bring in elements from other traditions that may feel more meaningful, to complement or to supplement. But I think if a person is interested in maintaining the continuity with the tradition insofar as incorporating all the traditional elements of a Jewish wedding ceremony, it can be done just with careful humanistic reinterpretation.
So Trask, I'll give you the last word here. Unmute.
There we go. So Sheila, our Madri, she doesn't like to do the circumnavigation 7 times because that implies that you're breaking down these barriers and bonding her as almost a servant to the man.
Hmm.
And that's where I was going. And then you had, the mutual circling. That kind of makes more sense. I'm studying kind of the same stuff at the same time right now. Uh, I noticed that in the Babylonian Talmud, they talk about They're not allowed to have sexual relations against the woman's will, nor when he is drunk, nor depressed or moody, or feels hatred towards his wife, nor if he's wished to divorce her. I liked the fact that she has rights within there. And in the Zohar, they constantly refer to the importance of her emotional feelings in sexual life, and it's not just, I'm going to do this and you're going to take it.
Definitely. Yeah, no, and I think it is important to be attentive to like those layers in the tradition, like a tradition that in many ways is problematic, is patriarchal. There's also dimensions of it that, yeah, we see as being, yeah, attentive to women's, physical and emotional needs, like offering, yeah, protection or like sort of safeguards against abuse. And then on the topic of circling, just something that I can mention regarding that, it's a custom that often I think we think of as being, very ancient, the storied tradition of circling. It's something that like really only enters the Jewish wedding repertoire in the like late medieval, early modern period. And like scholars think that it started as like a Polish Catholic custom and it was like an apotropaic kind of thing, like the bride circling the groom basically to protect him from demons who were jealous, like, oh, he's getting married and having children, let's protect him. And so Jews, as was the case in, every place in every period, they're immersed in this a broader culture. They're seeing what people around them, both Jewish and non-Jewish are doing. They're drawing influence from that, and that's, like an embodied kind of ritual that for whatever set of reasons resonated, with Jews in Eastern Europe, and they took it on. And now I haven't attended Polish Catholic weddings. I'm not sure if it's a thing that's still done, but yeah, Ashkenazi Jews still do it.
We noticed that in Spain too. The polygamy starts again in Spain with the Moors because they're allowed to have harems. So we see more polygamy occurring during that period of time, or at least more than I see in other texts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's
Well, I'm going to cut you off only because I'm appreciative of people's time. Eva, I would love to do an hour of question and answer with you, which is always exciting. Um, anyways, thank you all for coming and spending time with us. The third Thursday of every month, we have a program. Honestly, I don't know what's happening next month, but we'll be here and we'll send out notices to let you know. And special thanks to you, Eva, for your time and your research. And I'm so glad I got to read a portion and listen to a portion of what you did. A beautiful job of researching. So
thank you.
thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
See you all.
Yeah.